Hello, I'm Troy Bickham, and I am a professor of history at Texas A&M University, where I teach and write books on the histories of Britain and the Empire, North America, and the U.S. during the 16th and early 19th centuries. Today, I would like to explore a less discussed aspect of the American Revolution, the British perspective and experience. It's often easy to simplify the American Revolution as sort of an us versus them or colonists versus imperialism affair in which the good guys wore blue and the bad guys wore red. However, the conflict, like virtually all conflicts, was much more complicated than that. On the North American side of the Atlantic, there was a great spectrum of opinion about British rule that was intertwined with local politics. And the same was true of Great Britain. Moreover, these views were not stagnant. People regularly shifted and changed their views as the conflict progressed. This was, after all, one of Britain's most protracted and expensive colonial wars. And it was frustration at the length and expense of the war, as much as any sense that the Americans were winning, that compelled Britain to seek peace. After all, even though George Washington lost far more battles than he won, he and his army continued to persist year after year. There is, of course, a great deal that can be explored in Britain's American Revolution. What I would like to do is focus on three areas. First, by asking the question, did the British care about the American Revolution? Second, I'd like to look at the broad spectrum of British views, ranging from sympathy to hostility. And then finally, I'd like to look at the shifting views and strategies during the war. When I was in junior high, I recall reading in my history textbook that the snobby British gave little regard to the upstart colonists in their rebellion. In fact, the textbook declared, King George III wrote in his diary for July 4, 1776, that nothing significant happened. At the time, I found this a bit odd for two reasons. First, even then I knew that news took weeks, if not months, to travel from America to Britain, so the king was totally aware of the significance of that date when he was writing in his diary. Second, I found the Britain did not care viewpoint pretty unsatisfying. After all, if they didn't care, then why were they fighting? Wanted to let the Americans do what they wanted to do. Many long years of education later, I came to realize that my 12-year-old self-suspicions were well placed. First, George III, seen here, like most Britons, cared enormously about the American colonists. By the mid-18th century, Britain enjoyed a relatively free and very robust press that churned out millions of newspaper copies a year. Regional newspapers appeared weekly, but London had daily newspapers, and all of this was circulated by postal routes which spread throughout the country. People read newspapers at any one of the thousands of coffee houses that peppered the country and urban landscape. They read them at the breakfast table with their families and at the firesides with friends. Foreigners often marveled at how ordinary people, not just the elite, had access to news. Even the illiterate could listen to the news read aloud at street corners or by shopkeepers trying to drum up trade. Such reading was not merely for information. It served as the foundation of discussion, commentary, and criticism that made up what has since been dubbed the public sphere. This is a letter from a reader to the editor of the London Chronicle, dated December 24, 1774. This is an extract from that letter commenting on the situation. There is nothing so easy, or at least nothing that people are so free of, as giving advice to the nation. We have it from those who have no knowledge of our affairs and those who have no concern in them. We have it from foreigners as well as Englishmen, gentlemen and tradesmen, and from every corner of England. Now I own that I live in this country, and therefore I think I have a right to give my opinion in anything that concerns the public. During the American Revolution, that attention was focused firmly on the North American colonies. During the 7 Years' War, or often referred to as the French and Indian Wars, the national attention turned decidedly towards imperial affairs, and chief amongst them were the North American colonies, and this attention only increased in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, during the riots and disagreements of the 1760s and early 1770s. The explanation for interest was twofold. First, the American colonies were the leading overseas market for British goods. The colonists were prosperous and bought enough British goods from the rest of the empire to keep quite a few people in Britain employed, and they did so in vast quantities: books, tools, clothes, tableware, etc., etc. In fact, American colonists drank more tea per capita than the British, and tea at that time was produced solely in China, imported by the British East India Company merchants into London, repackaged and resold to the colonists, at least legal tea was. Not surprisingly, the merchants and manufacturers whose businesses relied on American consumers were intently interested in what transpired there. Peppered throughout the country, but concentrated in towns and cities like Glasgow, Bristol, Liverpool, and London, these people closely monitored and commented on American affairs. Second, and also worth noting, is that the distinction between Britain and American was not one that people generally made. Until the mid-18th century, American typically referred to as Native Americans rather than the white colonists. Certainly the younger versions of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson described themselves first as Englishmen and Virginians second, at least until the American Revolution. Such sentiments were reciprocated by the inhabitants of Britain. After all, a major justification for spending so much blood and treasure on defending the American colonies during the 7 Years' War was on the grounds that white colonists were British and therefore deserving of the protection of their countrymen. Britain and American-born people served side by side in the military. They intermarried, and they moved freely across the Atlantic. Colonists were a regular and largely indistinguishable feature in Britain before and during the American Revolution, as merchants, students, and lobbyists. Before the war, Benjamin Franklin spent years living in Britain, promoting his scientific inquiries and lobbying for colonial business interests. The Sheriff of London on the eve of the American Revolution was William Lee, of the Virginia Lees, who were Washington's neighbors. Lee was a merchant who moved to London to pursue the tobacco trade, and he got involved in politics while he was there. During the war, he left London and represented Congress to the governments of Austria and Prussia before finally returning to Virginia. George III's favored painter was Benjamin West. West was a Pennsylvania-born painter who pursued his career in Europe. His paintings of the period seen here became some of the most famous and celebrated at the time. During the American Revolution, West, who was openly sympathetic to the Americans, remained in the king's favor and often had debates with him. Even the member of Parliament for the city of Bristol throughout the entire American Revolution was an American colonist, Henry Kruger. Kruger was in England representing his family's New York businesses, and he got involved in politics, ultimately winning a parliamentary election in the port city of Bristol. His opposition to the war sat well with many of his constituents, whose economic welfare relied heavily on overseas trade. During the war itself, Britain, particularly London, was flooded with colonial refugees whose refusal to join the American rebel side had resulted in their being driven from their homes. Generally well-to-do members of the colonial merchant and plantation class, these loyalist colonists spent much of their time socializing with the British elite, hanging out in coffee houses, and increasingly advocating for a vigorous prosecution of the American War. Notable among them was William Franklin, Benjamin Franklin's eldest son and royal governor of New Jersey, who, unlike his father, remained loyal to Britain during the American Revolution. In short, the American Revolution was in many ways a civil war between patriots and loyalists within North America, and a civil war between the western part and eastern part of the British Atlantic Empire. Although sustained violence did not erupt in Britain, the American Revolution proved deeply divisive. To be certain, the vast majority of inhabitants of Britain were loyal to the British government, and criticism of the policies of the government should not be taken as the equivalent of unbridled support for the American independence cause. Moreover, supporting the American colonists during the 1760s, when even the most vocal critics in the colonies described themselves still as loyal Britons seeking reform of the imperial system, was fairly acceptable. After war erupted in 1775 and the American Congress declared independence the following year, open support for the American cause was very different because it was tantamount to endorsing treason. In consequence, sympathy and support evolved during this period, and for our purposes serves as a large umbrella that covered a wide variety of people and positions that often overlapped and intermingled. Many merchants and manufacturers whose business interests were harmed by the American boycotts of British goods and then by wartime interruption to trade were unsurprisingly vocal in their opposition to the war. They elected the likes of Henry Kruger and regularly petitioned the government for more lenient policy towards the colonists. To these can be added the large swaths of people in Britain who, like the colonists, had little representation in Parliament. You see, Parliament was not a truly representative body. First, seats in the upper house, the House of Lords, were overwhelmingly hereditary. You sat because your father, grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, and so on, did something to win the favor of the monarch who bestowed a title and a seat. The House of Commons, which was the more powerful of the two chambers by this period, and meant to be more representative of regular people, hence House of Commons, was hardly such. In fact, most members were either aristocrats themselves, relatives of aristocrats, or people who owed their seats to aristocrats thanks to an antiquated and corrupt system that gave disproportionately greater representation to rural areas at the expense of urban ones. And in rural areas, the aristocratic elite dominated. Moreover, not everyone could vote. Women and young men were excluded, but so too were men who were not part of the established religion, the Church of England. There were also an array of property qualifications that excluded not only the poorest inhabitants, but also artisans, tradesmen, and young people on professional career paths. All of these people were taxed, but not directly represented in Parliament. And so colonists' complaints of no taxation without representation fell on fertile ground. And various British petitions calling for political reform in the years leading up to the American Revolution often included demands for more conciliatory policies towards the American colonists. In fact, the largest peace petitioning movement in Britain before the 20th century was the drive joined by tens of thousands of Britons to press the king and Parliament to avoid war with the colonies. In truth, few people in Britain truly wanted war with the colonies, and this included the king and the prime minister. Although they believed in the case for war, they hardly reveled in the idea of ravaging the colonies and slaughtering civilians. The colonists were, after all, British subjects. News of the outbreak of hostilities at Lexington and Concord and then at Bunker's Hill was met with great lament, such as this London cartoon in which Britannia and America, represented by a Native American, are fighting under the sarcastic caption of Bunker's Hill or the blessed effects of family quarrels. London newspapers bordered their pages with black as a sign of mourning, and they openly lambasted the government, which was forced to appeal for public calm. In one sense, the outbreak was seen as a failure of British politicians to do their job and keep the peace. While one may not be sympathetic to the American complaints, many argued, surely war wasn't the answer. This British cartoon shows an angry America attacking Britannia. Most notable, however, are the men in the background who are holding Britannia down and preventing the British Lion from protecting her. They were the leading politicians of the day. This hesitation to fight included even the men who would prosecute the war. British commanders privately expressed their reluctance to go to America to fight their fellow countrymen, and officers resigned their posts rather than go and fight, most famously Admiral Lord Keppel, who only joined the fight later on once France had entered the war. Knowing that recruitment would be both popular and difficult, the British government tried to soften the blow by infamously hiring German troops. Often wrongly referred to as Hessians in America, in fact they hailed from a variety of German states. And sometimes called mercenaries, they weren't mercenaries. They were entire regiments leased by the British from German rulers, rather than individual mercenaries recruited by the British. These troops made up as much as a third of British forces in North America at various points in the conflict. During the war itself, criticism focused on the government's handling of the conflict, which became the acceptable way to voice opposition. Such criticism of the government again served as a broad umbrella. For some, it was an acceptable way to continue to express sympathy for the American position. After all, openly siding with rebellion was not a good idea. Now, opposition focused on military strategy, corruption, and unrealistic expectations. Matters were strengthened by a steady stream of British generals who, upon being recalled to Britain for failures, took up seats in Parliament and then launched media campaigns to vindicate themselves and their reputations at the expense of the British government. The common mantra was that the general was not to blame, rather it was the fault rested with the government and its unrealistic expectations and poor strategies. The American war, they increasingly argued, simply could not be won, and throwing more troops and money at the problem wouldn't work. Better to make peace and return the nation to prosperity. Britain was inundated with news from America, and chief among the sources was the array of American newspapers. While loyalist newspapers from the colonies, particularly British-occupied New York, circulated, the bulk of stories that circulated in Britain reprinted from the Patriot or the pro-revolutionary newspapers. These sources drove home the argument that the longer the war continued, the more embittered the colonists were becoming. Civilians suffered during wartime, as they do in any war, and despite British commanders' efforts, atrocities transpired. In fact, the American Declaration of Independence works to highlight some of the more inflammatory measures. Now, to be certain, this is propaganda, but it's stuff that hit home. This is from the Declaration itself. He, George III, is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. And the Declaration of Independence continues in its justification for independence. He, George III, has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and that's a reference to the British freeing of enslaved Africans in exchange for service in the British Army, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an indistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. And that's a reference to Britain's American Indian allies. In this popular London cartoon called The Allies, a group of American Indians share a cannibalistic meal of an American colonist with the Prime Minister, thus arguing that any crimes committed by Britain's American Indian allies were equivalent to the government of committing them themselves. Now, to be clear, none of these measures were unconventional in the 18th century in the Americas or really unique to the British. Although the British proved more successful at these practices, Congress did many of the same. In fact, Congress offered freedom to enslaved Africans in exchange for military service. And it sought allies amongst the American Indians, who as a people suffered proportionally far greater at the hands of the rebelling colonists than the reverse. The Americans also hired European mercenaries, albeit just a handful compared to the tens of thousands the British hired. Most famously, they hired mercenaries to train Washington's troops at Valley Forge in 1778. Notably, despite American protests, Britain did not fight an unrestricted punitive war against the colonies. Although there was plenty of violence, cities were not pillaged and plundered, nor were civilians rounded up and slaughtered with impunity. British soldiers caught pillaging and assaulting civilians were often court-martialed, and captured American soldiers were not simply put to the sword as a matter of policy. In fact, some of Washington's first correspondence as commander-in-chief was setting up protocols for prisoner exchanges. Nevertheless, the mantra of the opposition in Britain by 1777 was that poor strategy and misconduct were unnecessarily prolonging the war to the detriment of the British people. And these arguments ultimately prevailed. In early 1782, the British Prime Minister was unable to secure the necessary taxation for funding to continue the war, and soon afterwards was forced to resign in favor of a new Prime Minister, who immediately began peace negotiations with Congress. To be clear, when push came to shove, most people in Britain supported the government's case for war. However, like with the opponents, there was a wide spectrum of support in which the majority were probably lukewarm at best. The arguments in favor of the war were fairly straightforward and presented both in Parliament and the press. First, the arguments went that the American colonists were British, and with this came both rights, on which the Americans tended to focus, and responsibilities, on which the British government focused. The chief responsibility was obedience to the laws created by the King and Parliament. Being part of the empire and benefiting it came at a price, and that price was paid in taxes. To relinquish this claim was unfathomable. For example, Charles Gore, a Liverpool merchant, like many British traders in early 1775, waited anxiously in a crowded coffeehouse for news of American affairs. Despite the economic hardship a war would cause him, he vigorously supported the armed subordination of the colonies in a letter he wrote to a friend at the time. And this is what he wrote: "I have upwards of 5,000 pounds, which is a pretty substantial sum at the time, amongst the Virginians. Yet I hope the British government will not submit to their arbitrary demands. Submit now and always submit, for it is evident they are resolved to be independent." The second major argument in favor of war that the British government and its supporters presented was that the conflict was something of a rescue mission. Thanks to American loyalists who fled to London and their influence both in government and the press, the colonies were portrayed as overwhelmingly loyal, with only a few bad apples who were bullying the faithful majority and causing problems. A strong British force, they argued, would reinstate law and order for the benefit of the majority of colonists. And certainly, there are plenty of stories, both genuine and exaggerated, of loyal colonists suffering at the hands of the American revolutionaries. In this London cartoon, a group of colonists is seen bullying another colonist, having tarred and feathered him, shaved his head, and threatened him with death, hence the noose in the background. His crime? Working as an appointed tax collector. Surely, they argued, law and order needed to be preserved. Critically, the British wartime experience took a drastic turn in 1778, when Britain's ancient enemy, France, allied with the American revolutionaries. This turned an internal conflict into a global one. This was, of course, Congress's strategy from the start: bring in allies and spread the British so thin they could not effectively fight the war in the colonies. And this was precisely what happened. The war spread to the Caribbean, Asia, and Europe, and drew in both the Spanish and Dutch empires against the British, all seeking opportunities to strike a wounded Britain. The British Lion, such as in this cartoon, was outnumbered and surrounded. Meanwhile, in Ireland, which is part of the British Empire as well, leaders used the opportunity to clamor successfully for greater autonomy. And although the American Revolution still garnered plenty of interest and attention in the British press and amongst the government, the colonies took something of a back seat to the larger struggle for British survival. Things looked bleak initially, but they also looked familiar in that Britain was once again at war with its familiar foe, France, enabling one-time critics and lukewarm supporters of the American war to gather together. Officers such as Admiral Lord Keppel, who had refused to fight the Americans, took up their old posts to fight France, and newspapers across the political spectrum began to espouse their usual patriotic sentiments. The British almost immediately began to redistribute forces away from North America in order to protect their Caribbean colonies and home shores. Britain called out its militia to thwart the invasion of French and Spanish troops that were massing in Northern Europe, and it used its naval supremacy to pick away at the enemy's empires. The next few years were bleak, punctuated by the surrender of Lord Cornwallis and his army at Yorktown in Virginia, and then the destruction of the British East India Company's army at Pollilure in 1780. Yet by the end of the war, the British could proclaim a sort of victory. In Europe, the Royal Navy's supremacy thwarted French invasion plans, and combined with a plucky garrison, overcame a 3.5-year siege of British Gibraltar, celebrated in this epic painting by Benjamin West. In the Caribbean, the Royal Navy successfully captured enemy islands and humiliated the combined Spanish and French fleets at the Battle of the Saints, a massive confrontation that ended with Britain capturing both the French flagship and its admiral, both of which were brought back to Britain as prizes. At last, the British had a slew of wartime heroes and tales of bravery akin to the wars of old, and causes for public celebration. None of the messy baggage that had conflicted sentiments with war with Americans. When hostilities concluded, church bells rang out in celebration rather than mourning. This London cartoons reflects why, showing the weeping European enemies of Britain. The French, the Spanish, and the Dutch had been soundly defeated by the British, leaving Britain on its throne as the world's leading empire and poised for future expansion. In fact, the debts of the war famously plunged the French government into economic crisis that later precipitated the French Revolution. True, the American colonies were politically independent, but a generous peace in which Britain relinquished its claims over the American interior provided a salve to help heal the wounds of a fractured people. As much as some Americans might seek to have complete independence from Britain, the economic incentives of resuming their old partnerships proved too great. Trade between the two nations soon resumed, and very soon the United States assumed its former colonial role as key provider for agricultural resources and leading market for British goods. In fact, within a few years, American trade was worth more as an independent nation with Britain than it had been as colonies. Cultural ties, too, played a role as old friends, family members, and colleagues reconciled. Now, Benjamin Franklin famously left virtually nothing of value to his loyalist son, William, upon his death. Supposedly, Benjamin Franklin stated that if William's side had won the war, Benjamin would have no wealth to leave him. However, others were far more generous. John Adams, the first ambassador to Britain after the war, was deeply moved by his profound encounter with King George. In a ceremony marked by the usual pomp and circumstance of the king receiving a new ambassador from a foreign country, George III took the unusual opportunity and he broke protocol, and he offered a very personal, heartfelt remark of goodwill. Now, interesting, this is Adams, right? So John Adams is in Britain as the first U.S. ambassador to Britain. And he meets the king, former colonist meeting his old king. And he is in this sort of ceremony, which was typical for ambassadors at the time. And so he's meeting formally George III. And George III takes a moment and offers a very personal remark. And Adams is moved by these remarks. He records them and reports this back to George Washington and others in America. And this is what George III said. "I wish you, sir, to believe, and that it may be understood in America, that I have done nothing in the late contest, but what I thought myself indispensably bound to do, by the duty which I owed to my people. I will be very frank with you. I was the last to consent with the separation. But the separation having been made and having become inevitable, I have always said, as I say now, that I would be the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power. Let the circumstances of language, religion, and blood have their natural and full effect. In short, he was calling for meaningful reconciliation, not revenge. While the relationship between the two nations was not always smooth, especially initially, after all, the two nations would go to war one last time in 1812, the die for an entwined future was cast.